Problems of Perspective, Measuring Poverty in America by Jenny Lee and Corey Guen. Over the past few weeks, our Poverty and Human Capabilities course has spent a great deal of time defining and discussing the measurement of poverty in America. In doing so, we have played with semantics and word choice, considering the merits and issues with each method of defining poverty. Based on our readings, beliefs, and class discussion, we have arrived at our current definition. We have defined poverty as a lack of economic resources necessary to freely achieve the capabilities required to live a dignified life without continuous fear that one or more of those resources will be insufficient. Before we move into the implications of this definition, it's important to clarify some of the words and phrases we used in defining it. Let's start with the word freely or freedom. Freedom plays an important role in any definition of poverty. The best method for illustrating it is likely through an example. Consider two middle-aged men. One makes about $75,000 a year, but practices a form of religion that requires him to fast for long periods of time and live with extremely modest means. The other man makes just $12,000, and on some days must choose between paying his bills to remain warm or with water instead of eating. Both men are hungry. The religious man may eat even less than the other man. But who is really in poverty? Certainly a man who makes $75,000 a year is not impoverished. He has the freedom to live comfortably, to achieve a necessary set of functionings to live a dignified life. The other man has no choice to buy more food. He is limited in his freedoms by his income. The religious man lives a dignified life through voluntary actions that result in hunger. The other man's hunger is generated by circumstances beyond his own control. While the freedom from hunger or inadequate shelter may be serious considerations when defining poverty, freedom has to extend beyond this notion of basic necessity. A desirable set of capabilities in order to live a dignified life does not solely include the FCSU needs, that is, food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, as defined by Rebecca Blank, but other qualities are necessary to lead a dignified life. We'll address the nature of that phrase shortly. A desirable set of capabilities can include access to education, to certain social and recreational opportunities, or to appropriate health care, among other things. These additional qualities of life are important to consider in whether or not a person is poor or satisfied in life. The key in these capabilities, though, is the freedom to exercise them as decided upon by the individual. Martha Nussbaum explains this in her writing on capabilities when she says, "Capabilities, not functionings, are the appropriate political goals, because room is thereby left for the exercise of human freedom. There's a huge moral difference between a policy that promotes health and one that promotes health capabilities. The latter, not the former, honors the person's lifestyle choices." The language of our definition to this point leads us into two other important factors to address: the idea of living a dignified life, which we have used multiple times over the course of the presentation, and the concept of money and economics as the central focus of defining poverty in a practical sense. The first term, a dignified life, has something of an arbitrary definition. What would we be considering dignified? Poverty analyst Martha Nussbaum outlined 10 essential capabilities all people must have in some measure in order to live a dignified life. While many of her examples make sense, the cumulative effect and the concept that poverty must be defined based upon capabilities, or how well a person's life is going, is an impractical and likely immeasurable definition. Capabilities, or as Amartya Sen refers to them as, substantial freedoms, are the most important factors to consider when looking at a nuanced and accurate picture of poverty. But the most important of Nussbaum's capabilities, such as bodily health, control over one's environment, or access to play, are achieved by means of economic resources. As Professor Pickett noted in class, money is the avenue to a functioning, and therefore the most important capabilities we have the ability to impact are tightly intertwined with a family or individual's economic resources. Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen present a convincing argument for expanding the traditional view of poverty and its definition to be more focused upon the quality of life of those in question. But in doing so, they unfortunately accomplish little. In defining poverty, the end result is to understand a problem we are faced with and hopefully implement an effective solution to either solve or improve the situation. Sen and Nussbaum's expansion of poverty makes sense in determining the quality of life of individuals and households, but it presents a problem with no large-scale solution. Someone who lacks emotional capability, or the capability to connect with and appreciate nature, is not in poverty in a practical sense. Obviously, their lives may not be ideal, but restricting the use of the term poverty to solvable situations is key in implementing policy. While this may neglect a certain portion of the disadvantaged population of America, it hones in on one commonality of those who are by our definition poor, those lacking economic resources to live without worry or shame. This goes back to the last portion of our definition, living without continuous fear that resources will be insufficient. For me at least, an impoverished person's day-to-day activities are characterized by a nagging, omnipresent worry that they will not be able to make ends meet, so to speak. Nussbaum refers to this reliance on income and economic resources, the obviously more easily measured facets of poverty, as the fallacy of measure. While Nussbaum isn't wrong, we feel her definition is devoid of practical application. I could easily tell you who is struggling with Nussbaum's definition and how they are struggling, but if I have no way to help them through it with policy, the problem will only ever be acknowledged, never fixed.
When discussing poverty, how one would define poverty and how one would measure poverty can vary significantly. While a definition of poverty can be more complex, a measurement of poverty needs to be straightforward and reliable. These qualities make a measurement practical to implement as policy. Thus, we believe an absolute measure, specifically an updated version of the current U.S. poverty measure, is the most logical way for the government to measure poverty. An absolute measure says there is a definitive level of income or consumption where economic deprivation would fall below this line. Absolute measures reflect the truly basic needs approach to measuring poverty. Our current poverty measure in the U.S., the Census Bureau's official poverty measure, aka the OPM, is an example of an absolute measure. The threshold for the OPM is calculated by the value of a thrifty food basket, adjusted for family size and composition, and multiplied by 3. A household is defined as only those living together who are related by blood or marriage. Lastly, a family's resources, according to the OPM, only consist of gross annual pre-tax income. Near-cash benefits like earned income tax credit and in-kind benefits like supplemental nutrition assistance program and housing subsidies are not added as part of income. Non-discretionary costs like the money it takes for transportation to work or for childcare services are not subtracted from this calculation either. The OPM is criticized for not reflecting changes in social expectations. It also lacks depth, meaning it does not show how far from the poverty line people are. Additionally, it does not account for geographical differences. The OPM's threshold is outdated. In 1955, when the measurement was developed, families spent an average of 1/3 of their tax income on food. Today, food accounts for more around 1/6 of a family's expenses. However, the OPM has been highly supported for its straightforward way of measuring poverty and consistent demonstration of trends. It is good for determining eligibility, reinforcing why it is practical from a policy standpoint. On the flip side, there are relative measures. Relative measures are more focused on a comparative disadvantage. Thus, they are responses to changes in social expectations and standards of living. They reflect the capability approach to poverty. Relative measures are more complicated to calculate and are more subjective than absolute measures. Under the realm of relative measures, there are quasi-relative measures. The supplemental poverty measure, aka the SPM, is a quasi-relative measure. The SPM threshold is determined by the amount of income spent on food, clothing, shelter, and utilities around the 33rd percentile, multiplied by 1.2 to cover non-necessities. This is then adjusted based on family size and composition. A household is defined as the people living under the same roof, whether related or not. Finally, a family's resources, as defined by the SPM, include not only gross annual pre-tax income, but also add near-cash and in-kind benefits and subtract non-discretionary costs. The SPM is responsive to changes in standards of living and social expectations. It also factors in geographical differences as the cost of living varies from place to place. However, the SPM is criticized for its complexity and potential for abuse. Its complicated nature is not ideal for policy. It has also been accused of turning poverty into a moving target for policymakers due to its flexibility. We review the OPM and the SPM. The OPM's threshold is determined by income spent on food multiplied by 3. The SPM's threshold is determined by FCSU income multiplied by 1.2. A household is defined by the OPM as people living together who are related by blood and marriage, while it is defined as people living together under the same roof for the SPM. While the OPM only takes into account GAPT income, the SPM also includes benefits and non-discretionary costs. The SPM is more complex compared to the OPM. The OPM is better for determining eligibility for programs. The SPM takes into account geographical differences while the OPM does not. The OPM shows consistency, but the SPM is responsive to changes in society. Both measures, however, lack depth. Now that you have an understanding of the basics behind measuring poverty, let's go back to our view. To reiterate, government policy should be straightforward and reliable. Absolute measures demonstrate both of these qualities and are therefore most practical for policy use. Although the SPM is more comprehensive, it was not meant to supplant the OPM, as noted by expert Rebecca Blank. Moreover, the SPM is a poor measure for determining eligibility for programs, further making it impractical. Thus, although the OPM is outdated, it is consistent and logical. I think the best way to measure poverty in the United States would be to use an updated absolute measure. Using the OPM as the base, we would update how the threshold is calculated, since food takes up a different proportion of income now, and how a family is defined, since it is more common now for people to live together who are not married or related. In addition, drawing from the SPM, we would take into account benefits and non-discretionary costs into a family's resources. There will never be a perfect way to capture every dimension of poverty in a practical measure. However, we believe an updated absolute measure is a solid stepping stone towards addressing America's poverty.